"Don't come in here," shouted the millionaire to the poor old woman in the elevator. But 2 hours later, everyone at the company was shocked. In the heart of bustling New York City, an imposing skyscraper reached towards the sky. Its glass windows reflected the morning sun, hiding the secrets kept within. This was the home of Thompson Enterprises, one of the largest real estate and financial conglomerates in North America. What few knew was that, behind this empire stood Margaret Thompson, a 70-year-old woman who preferred to remain anonymous. Margaret, with her silver hair and piercing eyes, had built this empire from scratch, overcoming countless obstacles in a male-dominated world. Sitting in her modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, Margaret observed the silhouette of the building in the distance. Her hands, wrinkled but firm, held a cup of coffee as she reflected on the path that had led her here. "Mom, are you sure you don't want the driver to take you today?" asked Michael, her 45-year-old son, interrupting her. Thoughts. Margaret smiled softly. "No, son. You know I prefer to keep things simple. Besides, I feel like taking a walk today." Michael nodded, respecting his mother's decision, although he couldn't help feeling a twinge of concern. Despite her age, Margaret was still an unstoppable force, but lately he had noticed that she tired more easily. "As you wish, Mom, but remember we have the meeting with the new managers, Victor Reynolds and Marcus Green, today. Don't be late." Margaret nodded, remembering the names of the 2 men Michael had recently hired. Although she trusted her son's judgment, something in her instinct told her to be alert. As Michael left the apartment, Margaret prepared for her day. She dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, nothing that would reveal her true position. She took her worn leather handbag, a gift from her late husband, and went out onto the street. The hustle and bustle of the city enveloped her as she walked towards the bus stop. Around her, people rushed by, immersed in their own lives. Margaret enjoyed these moments of anonymity, observing the world she had helped build without anyone knowing. While waiting for the bus, her mind wandered to the early days of Thompson Enterprises. She remembered the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the tears shed in secret, but she also remembered the satisfaction of seeing her dream grow, of providing employment to thousands of people, and of changing the city's landscape. The bus arrived and Margaret got on, blending in with the crowd. As they approached the city center, the Thompson Enterprises building loomed larger and larger. Margaret felt a mixture of pride and nostalgia as she saw it. She got off the bus a block away from the building and walked slowly towards the entrance. Employees were coming and going, some in a hurry, others chatting animatedly. No one paid attention to the older woman approaching at a leisurely pace. Margaret took a deep breath before entering. Today was an important day. Although Michael didn't know it, she had decided it was time to personally evaluate the state of the company. Rumors about the new managers had unsettled her, and her instinct told her something wasn't right. With determination, she crossed the revolving doors. The lobby was a hive of activity, with the Thompson Enterprises logo shining proudly on the wall. Margaret headed towards the elevators, mentally preparing herself for what was to come. What she didn't know was that this day would mark the beginning of a series of events that would shake the foundations of everything she had built. The empire she had created was about to face its greatest challenge, and Margaret Thompson, the hidden heiress, would have to fight once again to protect her legacy. Margaret approached the elevator with a firm step, her worn leather handbag hanging from her shoulder. The lobby bustled with activity, but she moved with the calm of someone who knows every corner of the place, although no one knew it. She pressed the button and waited, discreetly observing her surroundings. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Margaret stepped forward. Just as she was about to enter, an authoritative voice stopped her in her tracks. "Hold it right there." The voice belonged to Marcus Green, one of the new managers, tall, impeccably dressed, and with a look that exuded arrogance. Marcus stood between Margaret and the elevator. "This elevator is for executives only. The service elevator is over there." Margaret blinked, surprised by the rudeness of his tone. Before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Come on, Marcus. Don't be so harsh," said Victor Reynolds, the other new manager, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Surely the lady is looking for the cleaning department, isn't that right? Margaret looked at both of them, maintaining her composure. Excuse me, gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Marcus let out a derisive laugh. There's no misunderstanding. This elevator is for important people, not for, well, you know, Victor added, with false kindness. If you're looking for work, I suggest you go to Human Resources, although at your age I don't know if we have anything suitable. Margaret felt her blood boiling, but she kept her cool. Years of experience had taught her to handle difficult situations with grace. I understand, thank you for the information, she said simply, taking a step back. The elevator doors closed, taking Marcus and Victor away, leaving Margaret in the lobby. She stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. The discrimination she had experienced was a clear indication that something was wrong in the company she had built with so much effort. What Marcus and Victor didn't know was that John Morrison, the Human Resources manager, had witnessed the entire scene from across the lobby. John, a middle-aged man with impeccable ethics, approached Margaret with concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" asked John. Immediately recognizing the true owner of the company, Margaret gave him a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, John, but I'm afraid our company isn't." John nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Thompson, what I just witnessed, it's not an isolated incident. Marcus and Victor have been creating a toxic environment since they arrived." Margaret listened attentively as John recounted several incidents of abuse of power, discrimination and mistreatment of employees. Her heart sank with each word, but her determination grew. "John, I need you to do something for me," said Margaret, her voice filled with purpose. "Gather all the evidence you can about Marcus and Victor's behavior, security footage, testimonies, anything, but do it discreetly." John nodded seriously. "You can count on me, ma'am." "Should I inform Michael about this?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. Michael trusts them, and we need solid evidence before confronting him with the truth. This will be a hard blow for him." As John walked away to fulfill his task, Margaret headed for the stairs. She climbed slowly, her mind working at full speed. The incident in the elevator had been a painful but necessary revelation. Now she knew she had to act to save not only the company, but also the values on which she had built it. Upon reaching the floor of Michael's office, Margaret paused for a moment to catch her breath. The climb had been exhausting, a reminder that she wasn't as young as she used to be, but her spirit remained as strong as ever. She entered her son's office without announcing herself. Michael was sitting behind his desk, absorbed in some documents. He looked up, surprised to see his mother. "Mom, what are you doing here? And why are you so out of breath?" Margaret sat down across from him, her face serious. "Michael, we need to talk. There are problems in the company, serious problems." Michael frowned, concerned by his mother's tone. "What kind of problems?" "The kind of problems that can destroy everything we've built," Margaret replied, preparing for a conversation that would change the course of their lives and the future of Thompson Enterprises. The silence in Michael's office was palpable as Margaret recounted what had happened in the lobby. With each word, Michael's face went from disbelief to shock, and finally to a mixture of anger and shame. "It can't be," Michael muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Victor and Marcus, I hired them personally. They seemed so capable, so committed to the company's vision." Margaret reached across the desk, taking her son's hand. "Michael, sometimes people aren't what they seem. What's important now is how we're going to handle this situation." Michael stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the office. "I have to talk to them immediately. This is unacceptable." "Wait," Margaret said firmly. "We can't act rashly. John is gathering evidence. We need to have a complete picture before taking action." Michael stopped, looking at his mother with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "How can you be so calm? They treated you horribly." Margaret smiled softly. "Son, I've faced worse things in my life. What concerns me is not how they treated me, but how they're treating our employees, the people who trust us." At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was John, with a grave expression on his face. "Mrs. Thompson, Michael," John greeted, closing the door behind him. "I have the information you asked for." For the next hour, John presented a series of devastating evidence. Security camera recordings showing Victor and Marcus intimidating employees, emails with abusive orders, and even anonymous testimonies from workers who feared for their jobs. Michael listened in silence, his face growing paler. Margaret, for her part, took mental notes, her mind already working on a strategy. "This is worse than I imagined," Michael finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "How could I have been so blind?" Margaret stood up, putting a hand on her son's shoulder. "It's not your fault, Michael. Victor and Marcus are skilled manipulators, but now that we know, we can act." "What do you suggest, Mom?" Michael asked, seeking his mother's wisdom as he had done so many times in the past. Margaret looked at John and then at Michael. "First, we need to protect our employees. John, I want you to implement an anonymous reporting system. Make sure everyone knows they can speak up without fear of retaliation." John nodded, taking notes. "Michael," Margaret continued, "you'll be in charge of investigating the projects that Victor and Marcus have been handling more thoroughly. I have a feeling their abusive behavior is just the tip of the iceberg." "And you, Mum?" Michael asked. Margaret smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. "I'm going to do what I do best. Observe from the shadows Victor and Marcus don't know who I am, and we're going to use that to our advantage." The three spent the next few hours planning their strategy. They decided to keep things secret for the time being, aware that a wrong move could alert Victor and Marcus. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Victor and Marcus were celebrating what they considered another successful day. "Did you see the face of that old lady in the elevator?" Marcus laughed, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey. Victor smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Yes, it was. Hilarious. But we have to be careful, Marcus. We don't want to draw too much attention before it's time." "Relax," Marcus replied, taking a sip of his drink. "Michael trusts us blindly. By the time they realize what's going on, it'll be too late." What they didn't know was that their reign of terror was about to come to an end. Margaret Thompson, the woman they had belittled, was about to demonstrate why she was the true force behind Thompson Enterprises. That night, as Margaret returned to her modest apartment, her mind couldn't stop turning over the day's events. Despite the physical exhaustion, her spirit was more alive than ever. She knew the coming days would be crucial for the future of the company she had built with so much effort. The next day, Margaret woke up before dawn. She dressed in the same simple clothes as the day before and left her apartment with determination. This time, however, she carried a small hidden camera, courtesy of John Morrison. She arrived at the company when barely the first employees were beginning to arrive. She mingled among them, observing and listening. The hushed conversations, the nervous glances, all confirmed her suspicions. Fear had taken hold in Thompson Enterprises. Meanwhile, Michael had spent the night reviewing financial reports and contracts. What he discovered left him cold. Victor and Marcus were not only abusing their power, but they were also manipulating figures to artificially inflate the value of certain projects. In the Human Resources office, John worked tirelessly to implement the new anonymous reporting system. He knew he was walking a very fine line. If Victor or Marcus suspected anything, the whole plan could fall apart. Mid-morning, Margaret found herself in front of the elevator again. This time, when the doors opened, Victor was inside. The man looked at her with disdain, but Margaret entered as if nothing was wrong, discreetly activating the hidden camera. "Here again?" Victor asked mockingly. "Didn't you get the message yesterday that this elevator isn't for you?" Margaret looked him straight in the eye. "Excuse me, sir, but I was under the impression that this is a public building. Is there any reason why I can't use this elevator?" Victor seemed surprised for a moment by Margaret's firmness. Then his face hardened. "Listen, old lady, I don't know who you think you are, but I suggest you stay in your place if you don't want to have problems." The threat was clear, but Margaret didn't flinch. "Is that the official company policy, sir, threatening elderly people?" Before Victor could respond, the elevator doors opened and Margaret exited, leaving the man furious and confused. Margaret smiled to herself. The recording would be more evidence for their case against Victor and Marcus, but she knew they needed more. Much more over the next few weeks. Margaret became a constant presence in the company. Always discreet, always observing, employees began to notice her. Some even smiled at her, grateful for her calming presence amid the tense environment. Michael, for his part, delved deeper into his investigation. He discovered that Victor and Marcus were not only manipulating figures, but they were also diverting funds to offshore accounts. The magnitude of the fraud was astounding. One afternoon, as Margaret was having coffee in the company cafeteria, she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. "Did you hear about Lisa from the accounting department?" A young employee whispered to her colleague. "They say she was fired this morning. Apparently, she asked too many questions about the financial reports." Margaret knew then that it was time to take action. That night, she met with Michael and John in her apartment. "It's time," Margaret said, her voice filled with determination. "Tomorrow we'll confront Victor and Marcus." Michael nodded, although concern was evident on his face. "Are you sure, Mum? Once we do this, there's no turning back." Margaret took her son's hand. "Michael, I built this company with the promise that it would be a fair place for everyone. We can't allow Victor and Marcus to destroy that." John intervened. "We have all the evidence we need, the recordings, the financial reports, the employee testimonies. It's a solid case." "Good," said Margaret, standing up. "Tomorrow, during the board meeting, we'll reveal everything, Michael. You'll present the financial evidence, John. You'll handle the employee testimonies." "And you, Mom?" Michael asked. Margaret smiled, a mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes. "I'll reveal myself as the true owner of Thompson Enterprises. It's time for me to come out of the shadows." That night, as the city slept, 3 people prepared for a battle that would change the fate of Thompson Enterprises forever. Margaret, Michael, and John knew they faced an enormous challenge, but they were united by a common purpose: to restore integrity and justice to the company they loved so much. What they didn't know was that Victor and Marcus also had their own plans, and they weren't going to give up their power without a fight. The next day promised to be one of the most dramatic in the history of Thompson Enterprises. The morning of the board meeting dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather foreshadowed the storm that was about to break out within the walls of Thompson Enterprises. Margaret woke up before dawn, her heart beating with a mixture of anxiety and determination. She dressed carefully, choosing an elegant but sober suit, very different from the simple clothes she had been wearing in recent weeks. Today she wouldn't be the invisible woman. Today she would be Margaret Thompson, the true force behind the empire. Michael arrived early at the office, going over the documents that exposed Victor and Marcus's fraud one more time. His hands trembled slightly as he organized the folders, aware that what he was about to do would change the course of the company forever. John, for his part, met with some key employees who had agreed to testify against Victor and Marcus. He assured them they would be protected, but he could see the fear in their eyes. "You're doing the right thing," he told them firmly. "Today is the day we take back our company." Meanwhile, Victor and Marcus arrived at the office, oblivious to the tsunami that was about to hit them. They entered the boardroom with the arrogance of those who believe themselves untouchable. "Another day, another dollar," Marcus joked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Victor nodded, but there was a shadow of concern on his face. "Have you noticed anything strange lately? Michael has been asking a lot of questions about the financial reports." Marcus dismissed his concern with a gesture. "Relax. We have everything under control. Besides, what's he going to do? Fire us? We're indispensable to this company." Little did they know that their world was about to crumble. At 10 o'clock sharp, the board members began to arrive. Michael greeted them with unusual seriousness, which didn't go unnoticed by those present. Victor and Marcus exchanged confused looks when they saw John Morrison, the human resources manager, enter with a stack of documents. Just as Michael was about to call the meeting to order, the doors of the room opened one last time. All eyes turned to the entrance where Margaret Thompson stood, emanating an authority that silenced the room. Victor and Marcus immediately recognized her as the old lady from the elevator. Their faces paled as they realized something was terribly wrong. "Good morning, everyone," said Margaret, her voice firm and clear. "For those who don't know me, I'm Margaret Thompson, the founder and true owner of this company." A murmur of astonishment ran through the room. Victor stood up abruptly. "What is this, some kind of joke?" Michael intervened. "It's not a joke, Victor, and I suggest you sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Over the next 2 hours, Michael and John presented a mountain of evidence that left everyone present stunned. Manipulated financial reports, recordings of Victor and Marcus abusing employees, testimonies from workers who had been threatened or unfairly dismissed. Victor and Marcus tried to defend themselves, accusing Michael of fabricating evidence, but their desperation was evident. Every time they opened their mouths, Margaret silenced them with a look that spoke of decades of experience facing men like them. "Gentlemen," Margaret finally said, addressing the board of directors, "as you can see, our company has been the victim of massive fraud and systematic abuse of power. I ask you to vote to immediately remove Victor Reynolds and Marcus Green from their positions and to initiate legal action against them." The vote was unanimous. Victor and Marcus were escorted out of the building by security, shouting threats and accusations until the last moment. When the doors closed behind them, a heavy silence fell over the boardroom. Margaret stood up, her presence filling the space. "I know you're all shocked by what you've witnessed today," she said, "but this is not the end. It's a new beginning for Thompson Enterprises. From today on, we will return to the values on which I built this company: integrity, respect, and justice for all, our employees." As she spoke, Margaret could see hope beginning to be reborn in the eyes of those present. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, rebuilding trust would take time, and the wounds caused by Victor and Marcus wouldn't heal overnight. But as she looked at Michael, who stood beside her with a mixture of pride and determination on his face, and at John, whose loyalty had been invaluable, Margaret knew she wasn't alone in this fight. The storm had passed, but the real work was just beginning. Thompson Enterprises was about to enter a new era, an era of transparency and justice. And Margaret Thompson, the hidden heiress, would be there to guide it, this time in broad daylight. The days following the dramatic revelation in the boardroom were a whirlwind of activity at Thompson Enterprises. The news of Victor and Marcus's dismissal spread like wildfire throughout the company, causing a mixture of relief, disbelief, and in some cases, fear of the unknown. Margaret, Michael, and John found themselves working tirelessly to stabilize the situation. Each morning began with a strategy meeting in Margaret's office, which now occupied the space that once belonged to Victor. "We need to be completely transparent with our employees," Margaret said during one of these meetings. "They've lived under fear. For too long, it's time they know they can trust us." Michael nodded, flipping through a report. "I agree, Mom. But we also have to deal with the financial damage. Victor and Marcus left a mess that will take months to clean up." John intervened. "And we can't forget about the employees who were unfairly dismissed. We need to do something for them." Margaret listened attentively to both, her mind working on a plan. "All right, this is what we'll do," she finally said. "Michael, I want you to organize a complete audit of our finances. We need to know exactly where we stand." Michael nodded, taking notes. "John," Margaret continued, "your priority will be to contact all the employees who were fired during Victor and Marcus's regime. Offer them the opportunity to return if they wish, with compensation for the damages suffered." John smiled, relieved to be able to do something concrete to help those who had been harmed. "As for me," Margaret concluded, "I'll be in charge of speaking directly with our employees. It's time they meet the real Margaret Thompson." The following days were a frenzy of activity. Michael immersed himself in the accounting books, working closely with the financial team to unravel the complicated fraud scheme that Victor and Marcus had woven. John, for his part, spent hours on the phone, contacting former employees. Many were skeptical at first, fearing it was some kind of trap, but the sincerity in John's voice and the promise of fair compensation gradually won their trust. Margaret, true to her word, toured every department of the company, from the cleaning area to the executive floors. She listened to the employees' concerns, answered their questions honestly, and most importantly, assured them that their voices would be heard from now on. One afternoon, as Margaret was talking to a group of employees in the cafeteria, a young woman approached timidly. "Excuse me, Mrs. Thompson," said the young woman, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Lisa Parker, from the accounting department. I was one of the people who noticed the irregularities in the financial reports." Margaret looked at her with a mixture of compassion and admiration. "Lisa, I've heard about you. You were very brave to question those reports." Lisa looked down, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't feel brave when Victor threatened to fire me. I was so scared." Margaret took Lisa's hands in hers. "Fear doesn't make you less brave, Lisa. What matters is that you did the right thing even when it was difficult. People like you are the heart of this company." Those words seemed to touch something deep in Lisa. She looked up, a spark of determination shining through her tears. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'd like to help with the audit if possible. I know the accounting books and I think I can be useful." Margaret smiled, feeling a wave of hope. "Of course you can help, Lisa. In fact, I'd like you to lead the internal audit team. What do you think?" The surprise and gratitude on Lisa's face were evident. It would be an honor, Mrs. Thompson. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Margaret replied with a warm smile. Meanwhile, Michael was facing his own challenges. The audit had revealed that the fraud was even more extensive than they had initially imagined. Victor and Marcus had not only embezzled funds, but had also compromised several important company projects. One night, Michael stayed working late in his office, surrounded by mountains of papers, and with his eyes tired from looking at the computer screen. Margaret entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Son, you need to rest," she said, placing a cup in front of Michael. Michael sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I can't, Mom. The more I investigate, the more mess I find. How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted them?" Margaret sat across from him, her face full of understanding. "Michael, you can't blame yourself for the evil of others. Victor and Marcus were expert manipulators. What's important is what we do now." "But what if we can't fix it?" Michael asked, doubt shadowing his voice. "What if the damage is too great?" Margaret took her son's hand. "Listen to me, Michael. This company has faced challenges before. When I founded it, many said a woman couldn't succeed in this world. But here we are. No matter how big the challenge, we'll overcome it. Together." Margaret's words seemed to infuse new energy into Michael. He nodded, squeezing his mother's hand. "You're right, we won't give up without a fight." In the days that followed, the team led by Lisa worked tirelessly on the audit. Her detailed knowledge of the accounting books proved invaluable, and soon they began to unravel Victor. And Marcus's complicated scheme. John, for his part, had managed to contact most of the former employees. Many accepted the offer to return, moved by the sincerity of the apologies and the promise of a new beginning. One morning, as Margaret walked through the company's corridors, she noticed something different. The atmosphere had changed. The fear and tension of weeks ago were no longer palpable. In its place, there was an air of caution but also of hope. Employees who previously avoided eye contact now greeted her with shy smiles. She heard animated conversations in the cafeteria, saw teams working together with renewed enthusiasm. Margaret stopped in front of a large window, observing the city that stretched out before her. She remembered the day she founded Thompson Enterprises, with nothing more than a dream and an unshakable determination. "We've come a long way," she murmured to herself, "and we still have a long way to go." But for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt they were on the right path. Thompson Enterprises was healing, slowly but surely, and she would be there to guide it every step of the way. As Thompson Enterprises began to slowly recover from the havoc caused by Victor and Marcus, a new challenge loomed on the horizon, one that would test the resilience of Margaret, Michael, and the entire team. One morning, Michael rushed into Margaret's office, his face pale and tense. "Mum, we have a problem. A big problem." Margaret looked up. From the documents she was reviewing, concern immediately visible in her eyes. "What's happening, son?" Michael placed a newspaper on the desk. The headline screamed, "Scandal at Thompson Enterprises, Corporate Cover-Up." Margaret quickly read the article, her frown deepening with each line. The newspaper alleged that the company had deliberately concealed Victor and Marcus's fraud, and that the recent cleanup was just an attempt to save face. "This is ridiculous," Margaret muttered. "We've been completely transparent since we discovered the fraud." Michael nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but the damage is already done. Investors are nervous, and some of our business partners are considering breaking contracts." At that moment, John entered the office, his face equally worried. "Mrs. Thompson, Michael, I just received a call. The Securities and Exchange Commission wants to conduct a thorough investigation of our operations." Margaret leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was a fierce determination in her gaze. "Well, if they want an investigation, they'll have one. We have nothing to hide." "But Mom," Michael intervened, "an investigation could paralyze us for months. We're just starting to recover." Margaret stood up, walking to the window. "Michael, John, listen to me carefully. This company was built on the pillars of integrity and transparency. We're not going to compromise those values now, no matter the consequences." She turned to them, her voice firm. "Michael, I want you to call a press conference for this afternoon. We're going to tell our side of the story, John. Prepare all the documents related to the fraud and our internal investigation. We'll voluntarily hand them over to the SEC." Both men nodded, once again impressed by Margaret's strength and clarity of vision. That afternoon, the media gathered in the conference room of Thompson Enterprises. The air was charged with tension and expectation. Margaret, dressed in a sober but elegant suit, stood in front of the microphones, Michael and John flanking her on both sides. "Good afternoon," Margaret began, her voice clear and firm. "I'm here to address the allegations made against Thompson Enterprises. Let me be clear, there was no cover-up. The moment we discovered the fraud committed by 2 former employees, we took immediate action." Margaret proceeded to detail the events chronologically, from the initial discovery to the actions taken to rectify the situation. She hid nothing, openly admitting the mistakes made and emphasizing the steps they were taking to ensure something like this never happened again. "We understand that these revelations may shake the confidence of our investors and partners," she continued, "but I assure you that Thompson Enterprises is more committed than ever to transparency and integrity. We will fully cooperate with any investigation and continue to work tirelessly to regain your trust." When she finished speaking, there was a moment of absolute silence before the room erupted into an avalanche of questions. Margaret, Michael, and John answered each one with honesty and clarity. Meanwhile, in an elegant bar downtown, Victor and Marcus watched the press conference on a wall-mounted TV. Their faces were contorted in grimaces of rage and frustration. "Damned old woman," Marcus growled, downing his drink. "How can she get away with this?" Victor, however, had a calculating look in his eyes. "She hasn't won yet, Marcus. I have some contacts at the SEC. Maybe we can influence their investigation." Marcus smiled maliciously. "I like how you think friend Thompson Enterprises hasn't seen the last of us." Back at the company, after the journalists had left, Margaret slumped into a chair, the fatigue finally visible on her face. Michael put a hand on her shoulder. "You were incredible, Mom," he said with admiration. Margaret smiled tiredly. "Thank you, son. But this is just the beginning. Difficult times await us." John, who had been checking his phone, looked up with a smile. "Maybe not as difficult as we thought. Social media is exploding with messages of support. It seems your honesty has impressed a lot of people, Mrs. Thompson." Margaret nodded, a spark of hope lighting up in her eyes. "Good, we'll use that. Public trust will be crucial in the days to come." As the sun set over the city, the three stayed in the office, planning their next move. They knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks they felt the wind was in their favor. What they didn't know was that Victor and Marcus were plotting their revenge, and that soon they would face a challenge that would test not only the company, but also the family ties that held it together. As the Securities and Exchange Commission's investigation progressed, Thomson Enterprises found itself in a delicate balance. On one hand, Margaret's transparency had won the support of the public and many employees. On the other, uncertainty about the outcome of the investigation kept everyone on edge. One morning, as Margaret was reviewing some documents in her office, she received an unexpected call. Her assistant informed her that Richard Howard, her former boss from decades ago, was requesting an urgent meeting. Margaret froze for a moment. Memories flooding her mind, Richard had been the man who had humiliated and belittled her at the start of her career, the catalyst that drove her to found her own company. What could he want now, after so many years? With some apprehension, Margaret agreed to the meeting. That afternoon, Richard Howard entered her office. The years had not been kind to him. His once black hair was now completely white, and he walked with the aid of a cane. "Margaret," Richard said, his voice hoarse with age, "it's been many years." Margaret looked at him steadily, her face a mask of professional calm. "Indeed it has, Mr. Howard. To what do I owe this visit?" Richard sat heavily in the chair in front of Margaret's desk. "I've been following the news about your company. It seems you're going through difficult times." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "We've faced challenges, yes, but we'll overcome them." Richard nodded slowly. "Of that I have no doubt. You were always a fighter, Margaret. That's why I'm here." He paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "I've come to ask for your forgiveness." Margaret was speechless for a moment. Surprised by this unexpected declaration, Richard continued, "I was a fool, Margaret. I belittled you, humiliated you, thinking a woman couldn't succeed in this world, and look at what you've accomplished." He gestured, encompassing the office. "You've built an empire, and you've done it with integrity, something I never managed to achieve." Margaret studied the face of the man before her. She saw genuine regret in his tired eyes. "Why now, Richard? Why after so many years?" Richard lowered his gaze. "I'm sick, Margaret. The doctors say I don't have much time left. And before I go, I wanted to make peace with my past. Mistakes, you are the biggest of them." A heavy silence fell over the office. Margaret felt a mixture of emotions, resentment for past pain, compassion for the broken man before her, and a strange sense of closure. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I appreciate you coming, Richard, and I accept your apology." Richard looked up, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Margaret. You don't know what this means to me." Just at that moment, Michael burst into the office, his face tense with worry. He stopped short when he saw the visitor. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were in a meeting." "Mom." Margaret immediately noticed the urgency in her son's eyes. "It's okay, Michael. Mr. Howard was just leaving." She turned to Richard. "Thank you for coming, Richard. I wish you the best." Richard slowly stood up, leaning on his cane. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything," with one last grateful look. He left the office. As soon as the door closed, Michael turned to his mother. "Mum, we have a problem. I just received information that Victor and Marcus are trying to manipulate the SEC investigation." Margaret straightened in her chair, all her attention focused on Michael. "What do you know exactly?" Michael began to pace back and forth, his frustration evident. "Apparently they have contacts within the SEC. They're trying to influence the course of the investigation, possibly even fabricating evidence against us." Margaret frowned, her mind working quickly. "We need concrete proof of this, Michael. We can't make accusations without solid evidence." "I know," Michael replied. "John is working on it. He has a contact inside the SEC who's willing to talk, but he's scared. We need to guarantee him protection." Margaret nodded. "Do whatever is necessary. If we can prove that Victor and Marcus are trying to obstruct justice, that will not only help us but sink them." At that moment, John entered the office, out of breath and with a triumphant expression on his face. "We've got it," he said, waving a USB drive. "My contact gave me their emails between Victor and one of the SEC investigators. It's clear they're trying to manipulate the investigation." Margaret and Michael exchanged glances. This could be the turning point they needed. "Excellent work, John," Margaret said. But we must proceed with caution if we make a wrong move, Victor, and Marcus could destroy any additional evidence that exists. Michael nodded, an idea forming in his mind. What if we take this directly to the head of the SEC? We bypass the potentially corrupt investigators and go straight to the top. Margaret considered the proposal for a moment. It's risky, but it could work, John. Do you trust your contact to keep this secret for now? John nodded firmly. Absolutely, he's as disgusted by the corruption as we are. Good, Margaret said, standing up. Then this is what we'll do, Michael. I want you to prepare a detailed report based on this new information, John. Make sure your contact is protected. I'll take care of arranging a meeting with the head of the SEC. As the three prepared to put the plan into action, Margaret couldn't help but think about her recent encounter with Richard. Life had taken many turns, and now she found herself fighting not only for her company, but for the principles she had always stood for. One more thing, Margaret said, stopping Michael and John before they left. Whatever happens in the coming days, remember why we're doing this. It's not just about saving the company. It's about doing the right thing, about proving that integrity and honesty still have a place in the business world. Michael and John nodded solemnly, determination shining in their eyes. They left the office with a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret was left alone, looking out the window at the city stretching beyond. She thought of all the battles she had fought over the years, of the obstacles she had overcome. This was perhaps the most important fight of her life, and she was determined to win it, not just for herself, but for all those who trusted her. With a sigh of determination, Margaret turned to her desk and began working on her strategy for the meeting with the head of the SEC. The final game was about to begin, and she was ready to play all her cards. The day of the meeting with the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather reflected the tension that permeated the offices of Thomson Enterprises. Margaret prepared with special care that morning, choosing a sober but elegant suit that exuded authority and confidence. Michael and John were waiting for her in the building's lobby, both with expressions of barely contained nervousness. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Michael asked for the umpteenth time. "If something goes wrong," Margaret interrupted him with a firm look. "Son, sometimes you have to risk everything to do the right thing. Trust me." The three of them got into a car waiting outside. The journey to the SEC offices was silent, each lost in their own thoughts and concerns. Upon arrival, they were escorted to a conference room on the top floor. The head of the SEC, a middle-aged man named Frank Pearson, greeted them with a serious expression. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, shaking Margaret's hand, "I must admit I'm intrigued by this meeting. It's not common for the subject of an investigation to request to speak directly with me." Margaret nodded, maintaining her composure. "I appreciate you receiving us, Mr. Pearson. What we have to discuss is of utmost importance and could change the course of your investigation." Over the next hour, Margaret, Michael, and John methodically presented the evidence they had gathered. They showed the emails that proved the conspiracy between Victor, Marcus, and some SEC investigators. They also presented employee testimonies and financial documents that demonstrated Thomson Enterprises' transparency since the fraud was discovered. As the presentation progressed, Pearson's expression went from incredulity to shock, and finally to barely contained fury. "If this is true," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we're dealing with a serious case of obstruction of justice and corruption within my own organization." Margaret leaned forward, her voice firm and clear. "Mr. Pearson, I understand this information is difficult to assimilate, but I assure you that every word is true. We're willing to fully cooperate with an impartial investigation. All we ask is that we be given a fair chance to prove our innocence." Pearson remained silent for a long moment, studying the documents before him. Finally, he looked up, a new determination in his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, I thank you for bringing this to my attention. I assure you I'll take immediate action. The investigation will be temporarily suspended while we conduct an internal audit of our own procedures." Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she knew the battle wasn't over yet. "Thank you, Mr. Pearson. May I ask what will happen to Victor and Marcus?" They will be thoroughly investigated, Pearson replied. If these accusations are proven, they will face criminal charges. As they left Pearson's office, Michael couldn't contain his excitement. We did it, Mom. We really did it. Margaret smiled, but her expression remained cautious. We've won a battle, son, but the war isn't over yet. Victor and Marcus won't give up easily. Her words proved prophetic. That same night, as Margaret was, working late in her office, she received an unexpected call. It was Victor. Impressive move, Margaret, he said, his voice dripping with venom. But if you think this is over, you're very wrong. I have information that could destroy not only your company, but also your family. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine but kept her voice firm. Is that a threat, Victor? Take it however you want, he replied. Just remember, this isn't over. The call cut off, leaving Margaret with a feeling of unease. She knew Victor was dangerous when he felt cornered, and now he was more desperate than ever. That night, as she returned home, Margaret couldn't help but feel that the real test was just beginning. She had faced many challenges in her life, but something told her that what was coming would test not only her strength, but also the family ties she valued so much. As she looked out the car window, watching the city lights pass by in a blur, Margaret promised herself that, whatever happened, she would protect her family and the company she had built with so much effort. The storm was coming, and she was ready to face it with everything she had. The days following the meeting with the head of the SEC were a whirlwind of activity at Thompson Enterprises. The news of the suspended investigation and the possible involvement of Victor and Marcus in acts of corruption had leaked to the press, generating a media frenzy. Margaret, Michael, and John worked tirelessly to maintain calm among employees and business partners, assuring them that the company was fully cooperating with the authorities and would emerge stronger from this crisis. However, Victor's threat continued to weigh on Margaret's mind. What information could he have that was so dangerous, and how could he have obtained it? One afternoon, as Margaret was reviewing some documents in her office, Michael entered with a worried expression on his face. "Mum, I need to talk to you," he said, closing the door behind him. "It's about Dad." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. Robert, her late husband, had been a sensitive topic for years. "What about your father, Michael?" Michael sat down in front of her, visibly nervous. "I received a strange call today. Man who said he knew Dad. He said he had information about some business Dad did before he died. Business that could compromise the company." Margaret sat motionless, her mind quickly processing this new information. "What kind of business, Michael?" "He didn't give details, but he insinuated they were illegal transactions, Mum. Is it possible that Dad—" Michael couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, memories flooding her mind. Robert had been a complicated man, brilliant in business but sometimes impulsive. They had had their differences, especially towards the end of his life, but Margaret had always believed in his integrity. "Michael," she finally said, opening her eyes to look at her son, "there are things about your father that I never told you, things I hoped I would never have to reveal." Michael looked at her, a mixture of fear and curiosity in his eyes. "What things, Mum?" Margaret took a deep breath before beginning. "Your father was an ambitious man, Michael. When we started the company, things were difficult. There was a time, many years ago, when we were on the verge of losing everything. Robert made some questionable decisions to keep us afloat." Michael listened in silence, his face a mask of contained emotions. "He made deals with people he shouldn't have," Margaret continued. "He moved money in ways that weren't strictly legal, I found out later, when it was too late to undo it. We had a big fight about it. It was shortly before his accident." The revelation fell like a bomb in the office. Michael stood up abruptly, walking to the window. "Why did you never tell me, Mum? Why keep this secret all these years?" Margaret stood up too, approaching her son. "Because I wanted to protect you. Michael, I wanted you to remember your father as the good man he was, not for his mistakes. And because I managed to fix most of those problems, or at least I thought I had." Michael turned to her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Do you think Victor and Marcus know? Is this the information they're threatening us with? Margaret nodded slowly. It's possible, if somehow they discovered the old records. What are we going to do, Mum? Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret took her son's hands in hers. What we've always done, Michael, face this together. With the truth, we won't allow the past to destroy everything we've built. At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was John with an expression of urgency on his face. Mrs. Thompson, Michael, he said, hurriedly entering. I just received news Victor and Marcus have called. A press conference for tomorrow. They say they have information that will shake the foundations of Thompson Enterprises. Margaret and Michael exchanged looks. The moment they had feared so much had arrived. John, Margaret said firmly, I need you to call an emergency meeting with the legal and public relations team, Michael. Contact Frank Pearson at the SEC. We need to get ahead of this. As John and Michael rushed out to fulfill their tasks, Margaret was left alone in her office, the weight of decades of secrets on her shoulders. She knew that the next 24 hours would be crucial, not only for the future of the company, but for her family's legacy. That night, no one at Thompson Enterprises slept. The legal team worked tirelessly, preparing strategies for every possible scenario. The public relations department drafted statements and prepared responses for the inevitable press. Questions Margaret, for her part, locked herself in her office with Michael, revealing all the details of Robert's shady business dealings that she had kept secret for so long. Each revelation was like a dagger in Michael's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve to protect his family's legacy. The next morning, the Thompson Enterprises team gathered in the conference room, all with dark circles under their eyes, but determined. Margaret was about to start the meeting when her assistant came running in. Mrs. Thompson, she said, breathless, you need to see this. They turned on the television just in time to see Victor and Marcus step up to the podium at their press conference. Victor, with a malicious smile, began to speak. Good morning, he said, his voice brimming with false sincerity. We're here to reveal the truth about Thompson Enterprises, a truth that Margaret Thompson has been hiding for decades. Margaret clenched her fists as Victor proceeded to detail some of the illegal transactions that Robert had made years ago. With each word, she felt the empire she had built with so much effort begin to crumble. But then Victor said something that made everyone in the room hold their breath. But that's not all, he continued, his smile widening. We have proof that Margaret Thompson not only knew about these illegal activities, but continued them even after her husband's death. A collective gasp ran through the room. Michael looked at his mother, shock and confusion evident on his face. That's a lie, Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. I never... But Victor wasn't finished. He proceeded to show documents and emails that, taken out of context, seemed to implicate Margaret in fraudulent activities. When the broadcast ended, a sepulchral silence fell over the room. All eyes were fixed on Margaret, waiting for her reaction. Margaret slowly stood up, her face a mask of determination. Listen to me, all of you, she said, her voice firm despite the emotional storm raging inside her. What Victor has said is a mixture of half-truths and outright lies. Yes, my husband made mistakes in the past, and yes, I covered them up, but I never, ever continued those practices. She turned to the legal team. I want you to analyze every document Victor has shown. We'll find a way to prove they've been manipulated. Then she looked at Michael, who was still in shock. Son, I know this is difficult to assimilate, but I need you to trust me. Everything I've done to protect this family and this company. Michael nodded slowly, trust gradually returning to his eyes. I'm with you, Mom, to the end. Margaret smiled gratefully before turning to John. John, I need you to call a press conference for this afternoon. It's time I tell my side of the story, the whole truth, without omissions. As the team dispersed to carry out their tasks, Margaret was left alone for a moment, looking out the window at the city sprawling before her. She had spent decades building her empire, protecting secrets and fighting against prejudices. Now, everything was at stake. But as she watched the bustle of the city, a new determination took hold of her. She wasn't going to allow Victor and Marcus to destroy everything she had worked for. It was time to face the ghosts of the past and fight for her future. With a deep sigh, Margaret turned to her desk and began preparing her statement. The final battle was about to begin, and she was ready to face it with all the strength and dignity that had characterized her throughout her life. The auditorium of Thompson Enterprises was packed that afternoon. Journalists, employees, and curious onlookers crammed into every available corner, all waiting in anticipation for Margaret Thompson's appearance. The air was charged with tension and speculation. Behind the stage, Margaret prepared for the most crucial moment of her career. Michael was by her side, holding her hand in a gesture of silent support. John was putting the final touches on security, ensuring everything was under control. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Michael asked one last time. "Once you go out there, there's no turning back." Margaret looked at her son, a mixture of determination and vulnerability in her eyes. "It's the only way, Michael. The truth, the whole truth, is our only hope now." With a final handshake, Margaret headed to the podium. Silence fell over the room the moment she appeared, all eyes fixed on her. "Good afternoon," Margaret began, her voice firm despite the nerves she felt. "I'm here today to address the accusations that have been made against me and against Thompson Enterprises. But before I address those accusations, I want to tell you a story. The story of a young woman who dreamed of creating something great, something that could change lives." For the next hour, Margaret narrated her life with a raw honesty that left the audience captivated. She spoke of her early days struggling against sexism in the business world, of how she met Robert, and together they founded Thompson Enterprises. "Robert was a visionary," Margaret said, her voice softening as she spoke of her late husband. "But he was also impulsive and at times took dangerous shortcuts. Yes, it's true that there were questionable transactions in the early days of our company transactions that I found out about too late to stop them." A murmur ran through the room, but Margaret continued, undeterred. "When I discovered what Robert had done, I had to make an impossible decision. I could report him and watch everything we had worked for crumble, or I could try to fix things quietly. I chose the latter." Margaret proceeded to detail how, after Robert's death, she worked tirelessly to correct the mistakes of the past. She showed documents proving how she had returned ill-gotten money, how she had restructured the company to ensure total transparency. "I made a mistake in not revealing all of this before," Margaret admitted. "But every decision I made thinking about protecting our employees, our clients, everyone who depended on Thompson Enterprises." Finally, Margaret addressed the specific accusations made by Victor and Marcus. With the help of her legal team, she dismantled each of their claims, showing how they had manipulated and taken information out of context. Victor Reynolds and Marcus Green are nothing more than opportunists who tried to take advantage of past mistakes for their own benefit, Margaret declared, her voice charged with indignation. "When we discovered their fraud, they resorted to extortion and manipulation to save themselves. But no more today, here and now. I'm laying all the cards on the table." As Margaret spoke, Michael and John watched the audience's reactions. They saw how initial incredulity gave way to understanding, and finally, to admiration. Margaret's raw honesty was having a powerful impact. When Margaret finished her statement, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, slowly, someone began to applaud. The applause spread quickly until the entire auditorium was on its feet, giving Margaret Thompson a standing ovation. Among the crowd, Michael noticed Frank Pearson, the head of the SEC, nodding in approval. He knew then that they had won. As Margaret left the podium, exhausted but relieved, she was greeted by hugs from Michael and John. "You did it, Mom," Michael said, tears of pride in his eyes. "You did it." Margaret smiled, feeling as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "We did it, son, all of us." As they left the auditorium, Margaret knew this wasn't the end. There would be investigations, questions, perhaps even legal consequences for past mistakes. But for the first time in decades, she felt truly free. There were no more secrets to hide, no shadows lurking in the corners. Thompson Enterprises had been shaken to its foundations, but Margaret was sure they would emerge stronger than ever, because now they had something that no amount of money could buy: the truth and the trust of their people. As the sun set over the city, Margaret looked to the future with renewed hope. The storm had passed, and although the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she was ready to face it. With her family by her side and the truth as her guide, Margaret Thompson was ready to write the next chapter of her extraordinary life. The months following Margaret's revealing press conference were a whirlwind of activity for Thompson Enterprises. As Margaret had foreseen, there were thorough investigations, long meetings with regulators, and intense scrutiny of every aspect of the company. But against all odds, Margaret's honesty had struck a chord with the public, the story of a woman who had fought against all odds, who had made mistakes, but had worked tirelessly to correct them, resonated with many people. Employees, far from jumping ship, rallied with renewed loyalty, proud to work for someone who had the courage to face her past. One morning, 6 months after the press conference, Margaret was in her office reviewing the latest financial reports when Michael entered, a broad smile on his face. "Mum, I have news," he said, barely containing his excitement. "The SEC has concluded its investigation. They've given us the all clear. We're officially free of any charges." Margaret let out a sigh of relief she didn't know she was holding. "And Victor and Marcus?" she asked. Michael's smile turned serious. "They'll be prosecuted for fraud, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. They'll never set foot in the corporate world again." Margaret nodded, a mixture of emotions crossing her face. Despite everything they had done, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for the two men who had come so close to destroying everything. At that moment, John entered the office, also smiling. "Mrs. Thompson, Michael, you have to see this," he said, turning on the television on the wall. It was a special report on Thompson Enterprises. The reporter was interviewing employees, business partners, and even competitors. Everyone spoke of Margaret's integrity, of how her honesty had changed, the way they viewed business. "Thompson Enterprises has become a model of corporate transparency," the reporter was saying. "In a world where corporate scandals are common, Margaret Thompson has shown that it's possible to run a successful company without compromising ethical values." Margaret watched the screen in silence, tears of emotion forming in her eyes. Michael put a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "You did it, Mom," he said softly. "You turned a crisis into an opportunity. You've changed the company forever." Margaret smiled, taking her son's hand. "We did it, Michael. All of us, you, John, every employee who stood by our side during the difficult times. This victory belongs to everyone." As the report continued, Margaret stood up and walked to the window, observing the city stretching out before her. She remembered the day she founded the company, how small and insignificant she had felt in the face of the vast corporate world. Now, decades later, she had not only survived, but had redefined what it meant to be a business leader. "You know what, Michael," she said, turning to her son and John. "I think it's time to take the next step." "What do you have in mind, Mom?" Michael asked, intrigued. Margaret smiled, a spark of enthusiasm in her eyes. "I want to create a foundation, one that helps women entrepreneurs start their own businesses, that teaches them not only to succeed, but to do so with integrity and purpose." Michael and John exchanged looks of surprise and admiration. "That's a wonderful idea, Mum," Michael said. "What would you call it?" Margaret looked out the window once more, her mind traveling through the years, remembering all the struggles and triumphs that had brought her to this moment. "We'll call it the New Dawn Foundation," she finally said, "because that's what we want to offer, the opportunity for a new beginning, for a bright future." John nodded enthusiastically. "I love the idea, Mrs. Thompson. We could use some of the company's resources to get it started. We could even offer internships and mentorships through Thompson Enterprises." "Exactly," Margaret said, her enthusiasm growing with each idea, "and not just that I want this foundation to be a beacon of business ethics. We'll teach these women not only how to succeed, but how to do it the right way." As they discussed the details, Margaret felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. She had spent so much time fighting, defending herself, trying to correct the mistakes of the past. Now, finally, she could look to the future with hope and purpose. In the months that followed, the new dawn, Foundation went from being an idea to a reality. Margaret worked tirelessly, using her decades of experience and her network of contacts to create a comprehensive support program for women entrepreneurs. The day of the Foundation's inauguration arrived with great expectation. The Thompson Enterprises Auditorium was filled with young and enthusiastic women, all waiting to hear from Margaret Thompson, the woman who had become a symbol of resilience and ethics in the business world. Margaret took the podium, her heart full of emotion. She looked at the audience and saw in those young faces the reflection of herself so many years ago, full of dreams, ambition, desire to change the world. "Welcome," she began, her voice strong and clear. "You're here because you have a dream of creating something of your own, of leaving your mark on the world. I'm here to tell you that dream is possible, but I'm also here to tell you that the path won't be easy." Margaret told them about her own struggles, about the obstacles she had faced as a woman in a male-dominated world. She told them about her mistakes, about the hard lessons she had learned. "But above all," she continued, "I want you to understand this. True success isn't measured only in money or power. It's measured in the positive impact you have on the lives of others, in the integrity with which you conduct your business, in the legacy you leave for future generations." As she spoke, Margaret saw tears in the eyes of some women, determination on the faces of others. She knew then that she had made the right decision. This was her true legacy, more valuable than any corporate empire. As she concluded her speech, Margaret announced the Foundation's first program, a contest for ethical business plans with funding and mentorship for the winners. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable. After the event, as Margaret was preparing to leave, a young woman approached her timidly. "Mrs. Thompson," the young woman said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to thank you. Your story. It's given me hope. I thought I had to choose between success and my values. You've shown me I can have both." Margaret smiled, moved by the young woman's sincerity. "What's your name?" "Emily," the young woman replied. "Well, Emily," Margaret said, putting a hand on her shoulder, "remember this. Your values aren't an obstacle to your success. They're your greatest strength. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." As Emily walked away with a new confidence in her step, Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. Through the New Dawn Foundation, she could touch the lives of hundreds, maybe thousands of women like Emily. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she reflected on the long and tortuous road that had led her to this moment. She had faced discrimination, betrayal, scandals, and the near destruction of everything she had built. But through it all, she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. She looked at Robert's photo on her bedside table. "We did it, my love," she whispered, "not in the way we expected, but we did it. Our legacy will live on, not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the lives we'll touch." As she fell asleep, Margaret Thompson smiled. The hidden heiress had come out of the shadows and was now ready to light the way for generations to come. Her story was not just one of personal redemption, but of the transformation of an empire built on secrets into a beacon of hope and ethics. And so, with the birth of the New Dawn Foundation, a new chapter began in the extraordinary life of Margaret Thompson, a chapter full of promises, new challenges, and, above all, the opportunity to create a lasting legacy that would transcend far beyond her own life.